August 1945. A humid morning settles over the outskirts of Tokyo. Smoke still rises from districts burned flat by months of aerial bombardment. The air smells of ash, damp wood, and medicine. In the shadow of a partially standing hospital wing, children sit on the ground in quiet rows. Their clothes hang loose. Their hair is cropped short or uneven, cut hastily during air raids. Some stare forward. Others look down, conserving energy. They are Japanese war orphans. Many no longer know where their parents are or if they are alive. For years, authority arrived in the form of sirens, commands, and discipline. Then suddenly the war stopped. Now unfamiliar figures move among them. American nurses in plain uniforms kneel beside children who speak no English. There are no raised voices, no interrogations. Only thermometers, bandages, careful hands. A nurse lifts a child's chin to examine a fevered face. Another records weights and symptoms on a clipboard. To the watching children, this scene feels unreal. These were supposed to be enemies. Instead, they are caregivers, treating every child the same, without question, without hesitation. In this moment, defeat gives way to something quieter. And as medicine replaces weapons, a new chapter of the war's aftermath begins. One that few had anticipated. By the summer of 1945, Japan stood at the edge of collapse. The war that had begun with expansion and confidence now returned home in waves of fire, hunger, and dislocation. Long before surrender, Japanese society was already unraveling under the weight of sustained aerial bombardment and economic exhaustion. From late 1944 onward, American strategic bombing shifted decisively toward Japan's urban centers. The introduction of the B-29 Superfortress, operating from bases in the Marianas, allowed the U.S. Army Air Forces to strike the home islands with unprecedented range and payload. Initial high-altitude precision raids gave way to low-altitude incendiary attacks designed to cripple industrial output dispersed among civilian neighborhoods. On the night of March 9 to 10, 1945, Tokyo burned. Operation Meeting House destroyed more than 16 square miles of the capital. An estimated 100,000 civilians died in a single night. Over 1 million were left homeless. Similar raids followed in Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and dozens of regional cities. Wooden housing, dense populations, and limited civil defense made urban Japan uniquely vulnerable. The destruction of housing carried consequences beyond immediate casualties. Families were fractured. Children were separated in the chaos of firestorms and evacuation orders. Schools closed indefinitely. Local administrations, already strained by conscription and shortages, lost buildings, records, and personnel. By early 1945, the Japanese government had initiated mass evacuations of children from major cities to rural areas. These programs, intended to protect the young from bombing, often created new vulnerabilities. Transport was limited. Host families were overwhelmed. Food supplies in the countryside were insufficient to support the influx. Many children became effectively unaccounted for, moved repeatedly, separated from siblings, or left behind when caretakers fell ill or fled. At the same time, Japan's adult population was being steadily drained. Men of military age were absorbed into the armed forces. Older men and women were mobilized for civil defense, factory labor, and emergency services. Mothers often worked long hours or were displaced themselves. In this environment, children, especially the very young, were left exposed. By the time Allied planners assessed post-war conditions in mid-1945, intelligence reports painted a stark picture. Malnutrition among children was widespread. Diseases such as tuberculosis, dysentery, and respiratory infections were increasing. Orphanages, where they existed at all, were overcrowded and under-resourced. Informal care networks struggled to cope. Yet within Allied operational planning, these realities occupied little space. The primary focus remained military defeat, surrender terms, and occupation security. Civil affairs doctrine addressed sanitation, utilities, and basic law enforcement. Long-term child welfare was assumed to be the responsibility of local authorities or international relief agencies to be deployed later. In the Pacific Theater, this gap was even more pronounced. The planned invasion of Japan, Operations Olympic and Coronet, had prioritized logistics for combat forces, not civilian relief on a massive scale. Casualty estimates focused on soldiers, not children. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9 accelerated the collapse. Entire populations were displaced in seconds. Medical systems ceased to function. Thousands of children were left without parents, caregivers, or shelter almost immediately. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the fighting stopped, but the humanitarian crisis did not. It became visible in streets filled with rubble, in makeshift shelters under bridges, and in hospital corridors crowded with civilians suffering from burns, malnutrition, and untreated illness. American occupation forces, arriving under the authority of the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, encountered a society intact in discipline but shattered in capacity. The Japanese state still existed, but its ability to care for its most vulnerable citizens had been critically weakened. Among those most affected were children who had lost parents during bombing raids, evacuations, or the final months of fighting. Some wandered in small groups. Others were absorbed temporarily by neighbors or institutions barely functioning themselves. Many had no documentation. Few had access to consistent food or medical care. For American medical personnel, particularly nurses attached to army hospitals and relief units, these children would soon become impossible to ignore. Their presence was not part of initial mission briefings, but it would increasingly define the human reality of occupation. And it was within this environment of devastation, administrative exhaustion, and unmet need that U.S. nurses would encounter Japanese war orphans, not as enemy symbols, but as patients standing at the intersection of defeat and survival. The arrival of American forces in Japan in late August and early September 1945 introduced a form of authority unlike any the population had previously experienced. The surrender had preserved the Japanese imperial institution, but effective power now rested with Allied occupation forces. Military control was firm, yet outwardly restrained. There were no victory parades through ruined cities, no mass reprisals. Instead, there was order, quiet, deliberate, procedural. For civilians, this restraint was unsettling. Years of wartime propaganda had portrayed Americans as brutal and vengeful. The sudden absence of violence did not immediately produce relief. Produced uncertainty. This uncertainty was especially acute for children, who had been taught to fear capture more than death. In the weeks following surrender, American units spread rapidly across the home islands. Ports were secured, airfields occupied, communication nodes taken under control. Alongside combat units, medical detachments and Army Nurse Corps personnel began establishing hospitals in requisition buildings, schools, universities, government offices, and surviving medical facilities. These hospitals were designed primarily to serve Allied troops. But the reality outside their walls quickly intruded. Civilians arrived seeking treatment. Among them were children suffering from malnutrition, untreated burns, infections, and chronic illnesses exacerbated by years of deprivation. Many came alone. Some were brought by elderly relatives or neighbors who could no longer provide care. Japanese medical infrastructure, though professionally trained, was crippled by shortages. Medicines were scarce. Equipment had been destroyed or repurposed. Hospitals lacked fuel, clean water, and adequate nutrition for patients. Even when doctors were present, they often lacked the means to treat effectively. American medical units possessed resources that appeared extraordinary by comparison. Field hospitals were stocked with antibiotics, bandages, surgical tools, and organized supply chains. For the first time in years, penicillin was available in significant quantities. For children with infections that had once been fatal, survival became possible. Within this environment, U.S. nurses encountered Japanese war orphans not as a category, but as individuals, children arriving with no paperwork, no guardians, and no clear destination once treated. Military regulations did not provide clear guidance for such cases. Nurses were trained to treat patients, not to adjudicate custody or welfare. Yet care could not end at the hospital door. Discharging a child back into the streets was not a neutral act. Medical staff recognized that recovery required stability, food, shelter, follow-up care. These needs existed outside formal orders, but they were impossible to ignore. Coordination with Japanese authorities began cautiously. Local officials were consulted when available. Temporary arrangements were made with surviving orphanages, Buddhist temples, and community organizations. But capacity was limited, and many facilities were themselves in crisis. In response, informal systems developed. Nurses documented names when possible, noting distinguishing features or remembered hometowns. Children were grouped by age and condition. Feeding schedules were established using surplus rations adjusted for civilian needs. Medical rounds extended beyond Allied wards into makeshift civilian spaces. These actions were not framed as benevolence. They were framed as necessity. Disease did not respect nationality. Malnutrition complicated recovery. Unattended children posed risks not only to themselves but to broader public health efforts underway across Japan. For Japanese observers, the sight was disorienting. American nurses treated children without reference to allegiance. There were no interrogations. No distinctions made between those whose parents had fought and those whose families had suffered under bombing. Treatment followed medical need alone. This approach contradicted deeply ingrained wartime expectations. Authority in Japan had always been hierarchical and ideological. Care had been conditional, shaped by duty and contribution. To see foreign military personnel provide treatment without question challenged assumptions about power and intent. Trust did not come quickly. Many children were fearful, refusing food or recoiling from touch. Some expected punishment. Others had been warned against accepting aid. But repeated encounters produced gradual change. Clean bandages replaced fear. Regular meals replaced hunger. Routine softened suspicion. By early autumn 1945, these practices were no longer isolated. Reports circulated within occupation medical commands describing civilian pediatric cases in increasing numbers. What began as ad hoc care was becoming a recognized aspect of medical operations. And as American nurses continued to treat Japanese war orphans simply as patients, without ideological filter or enemy distinction, their actions began to reshape how occupation itself was experienced, setting the stage for deeper moral, military, and institutional implications that would soon follow. From the human angle, the encounter between Japanese war orphans and American nurses unfolded without spectacle. There were no cameras, no declarations, no language of reconciliation. What existed instead were small, repetitive actions, hands cleaning wounds, voices counting breaths, food placed carefully within reach. For children who had known war only as deprivation and fear, these moments did not register as mercy. They registered as confusion. Most Japanese children in 1945 had grown up under constant mobilization. Schools had been reorganized around labor. Youth groups had replaced childhood routines with drills and discipline. Care had always been conditional, tied to obedience, endurance, and sacrifice. When American nurses treated children without reference to background or belief, the absence of judgment itself became unsettling. There were no questions about loyalty, no lectures, no symbols, only procedure. This procedural care carried emotional weight. Children expected interrogation. Instead, they were weighed. They expected punishment. Instead, they were fed. Recovery occurred not through persuasion, but through consistency. Over days and weeks, the predictability of treatment began to reshape expectations. Authority no longer appeared solely as something that demanded suffering, could also organize relief. From the military angle, these actions were interpreted differently. U.S. occupation planners viewed civilian health not as an abstract moral concern, but as a foundational element of stability. Malnutrition weakened labor capacity. Disease threatened infrastructure recovery. Orphans moving unpredictably through urban ruins complicated security. Feeding and treating children reduced pressure on patrols, hospitals, and supply depots. Medical officers translated humanitarian care into operational terms. Treating children was not framed as generosity, it was framed as prevention. Preventing outbreaks, preventing disorder, preventing long-term instability that could undermine occupation objectives. Nursing staff became, in effect, stabilizing agents embedded within civilian society. This alignment between care and control was not contradictory. It was structural. Order in occupied Japan depended not only on disarmament, but on the restoration of basic social function. Children, as the most vulnerable population, served as a diagnostic indicator. Where children stabilized, communities followed. The moral angle emerged gradually, often without explicit acknowledgement. American nurses were not tasked with addressing guilt or responsibility for the war. They did not arrive as moral arbiters. Yet their actions carried moral consequence. They treated children whose suffering was the direct result of strategic bombing decisions made by their own government. This reality existed beneath the surface of daily routines. Official documentation avoided emotional language. Reports described numbers, conditions, recovery rates. But internal correspondence occasionally reflected a quieter awareness. Children were classified explicitly as non-combatants. Their treatment required no justification beyond medical need. In this framing, care became a statement, not about forgiveness but about responsibility exercised through action. For Japanese civilians observing these interactions, the effect was cumulative. Each treated child contradicted expectations shaped by years of propaganda. The enemy was not behaving as predicted. This did not erase fear or resentment, but it introduced doubt. Authority, once imagined solely as punishment, now appeared capable of restraint. These perspectives, human vulnerability, military necessity, and moral consequence, did not exist in isolation. They overlapped, reinforcing one another. Care stabilized communities. Stability supported occupation goals. Occupation goals, in turn, normalized care. And as these dynamics took hold across hospitals, shelters, and improvised clinics, the role of American nurses expanded beyond treatment, drawing the occupation into deeper institutional and psychological territory that would soon define the next phase of the story. From the institutional angle, what had begun as emergency medical response slowly hardened into structure. In the weeks following Japan's surrender, American occupation authorities moved from improvisation to coordination. Temporary clinics became assigned facilities. Nursing schedules were standardized. Supply chains were adjusted to account for pediatric needs, milk powder, vitamin supplements, basic sanitation materials. Child treatment was no longer incidental. It was planned. Occupation directives issued under the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers framed public health as a priority equal to infrastructure repair. Children, especially orphans, were identified as a distinct administrative category. Records were created where none existed. Names were logged when possible. Ages were estimated. Physical conditions were documented systematically. These measures were not symbolic. They were foundational. Administration replaced chaos through documentation. This institutionalization altered the nature of authority itself. Power was no longer expressed primarily through checkpoints or patrols. It was exercised through schedules, routines, and medical oversight. Nurses became visible representatives of occupation governance. Not armed, not threatening, but unmistakably authoritative. Their presence signaled continuity. Where nurses remained, order followed. The enemy perception angle revealed the psychological depth of this shift. Japanese children had been raised to view surrender as disgrace and enemies as cruel. The idea that foreign soldiers or their medical staff would treat Japanese children without discrimination conflicted directly with everything they had been taught. Initial reactions were often withdrawal rather than gratitude. Some children avoided clinics. Others accepted treatment silently, waiting for consequences that never arrived. Over time, predictability changed behavior. Meals arrived regularly. Treatments followed routine. No ideological instruction accompanied care. There were no demands for loyalty, no rituals of submission. Authority manifested as consistency. This challenged deeply ingrained expectations. The enemy did not disappear, but its definition softened, becoming less absolute and less terrifying. For adults, especially surviving caregivers and local officials, This transformation carried broader implications. The occupation was no longer perceived solely as punitive oversight. It was increasingly understood as a system capable of sustaining daily life. This did not imply approval. It implied adaptation. Cooperation emerged not from persuasion, but from necessity and reliability. The administrative angle tied these developments together. American occupation planners recognized that child welfare outcomes could be measured. Health indicators improved. Disease rates declined. Instances of children wandering unsupervised decreased where shelters and clinics operated consistently. These metrics reinforced policy decisions. Care was no longer justified only morally or emotionally, it was validated statistically. As months passed, responsibility began to shift. Japanese medical professionals were gradually reintegrated under supervision. Training programs were introduced. Relief organizations supplemented military-run facilities. The American role evolved from direct provider to overseer, ensuring continuity rather than dominance. This transition was deliberate, designed to prevent collapse once military staff withdrew. For Japanese war orphans, the experience left a lasting imprint. Their first sustained interaction with the victorious enemy was not through interrogation or punishment, but through care delivered without explanation or demand. This did not resolve trauma. It did not erase loss, but it reframed authority during a formative moment. By late 1945, the patterns established in clinics and shelters had become part of a broader occupation framework. What began as treatment expanded into governance. What began as emergency response became policy. And with that shift, the story approached its decisive turning point, when caregiving ceased to be an exception and became an expectation, redefining the meaning of control in a defeated society. The turning point did not arrive with an announcement. There was no single order that declared a new phase. Instead, it emerged through repetition, through routines that hardened into policy as weeks passed after Japan's surrender in August 1945. By early September, the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers had begun formalizing occupation authority across Japan. Military priorities shifted rapidly. Combat operations were complete. The threat was no longer armed resistance, but societal collapse. Food shortages deepened. Public health risks multiplied. And among the most vulnerable were children with no families, no records, and no means of survival outside institutional care. American medical units, already operating field hospitals and emergency clinics, became the backbone of a broader stabilization effort. What distinguished this moment was scale. Treatment of enemy children was no longer limited to isolated clinics or individual initiatives by nurses and medics. It became systematized. Pediatric care schedules were introduced. Nutritional standards were defined. Vaccination programs expanded. Children were weighed, examined, and tracked over time. This shift marked a decisive change in how authority was exercised. Care was no longer reactive. It was planned. Occupation governance began to express itself through health metrics rather than security reports. Success was measured not only in compliance, but in recovery rates. The presence of American nurses became central to this transformation. Their work embodied a contradiction that reshaped perception on both sides. They represented a victorious power whose weapons had destroyed cities. Yet their daily tasks involved feeding, cleaning, and treating the children who lived among those ruins. This duality was not lost on occupation planners. Nor was it lost on the Japanese population observing these scenes. For Japanese war orphans, the impact was immediate and profound. The uncertainty of the immediate post-surrender weeks began to ease as routines stabilized. Clinics operated on schedules. Shelters maintained order. Meals arrived predictably. Medical care followed protocols rather than improvisation. Authority became something consistent rather than sudden. This consistency altered behavior. Children who had initially avoided clinics began returning. Weight loss slowed. Disease outbreaks declined. Mortality rates among displaced minors fell noticeably in areas with sustained medical oversight. These outcomes reinforced policy decisions at higher levels. Child care was no longer viewed as an auxiliary concern. It became evidence that occupation authority could function without constant coercion. Administratively, this moment represented consolidation. Temporary directives issued during the first weeks after surrender were replaced by standing orders. Medical officers were assigned specifically to civilian pediatric care. Supply units adjusted logistics to ensure continuous delivery of food and medical materials. Coordination with emerging Japanese administrative bodies increased, though under strict supervision. The moral dimension of this shift was present, but unspoken. Official memoranda rarely referenced compassion. They emphasized responsibility, stability, and long-term security. Yet the underlying reality was unavoidable. Victory had created obligations that extended beyond disarmament and control. Children, clearly defined as non-combatants, became a test of how that responsibility would be exercised. This was the moment when treatment without question ceased to be remarkable and became expected. The enemy child was no longer an exception to policy. Care was no longer discretionary. It was embedded. As this new framework took hold across occupied Japan, its implications extended far beyond clinics and shelters. It reshaped how occupation itself was understood, transforming authority from an instrument of dominance into a mechanism of sustained order. And it set the stage for the second half of the turning point, when these practices would expand, normalize, and redefine the post-war landscape. By late autumn 1945, the transformation was no longer confined to individual facilities. It was visible across the occupation system itself. What had begun as emergency medical care for displaced children had evolved into a coordinated structure linking hospitals, shelters, supply depots, and administrative offices under a single operational logic. American occupation authorities now treated child welfare as a stabilizing pillar. Medical data flowed upward through command channels. Reports tracked malnutrition trends, infection rates, and recovery timelines. These figures informed broader decisions about food allocation, housing priorities, and public health planning. For the first time since the war began, the condition of children influenced strategic administration rather than reacting to it. U.S. nurses continued to occupy a central role, but their work increasingly reflected institutional continuity rather than improvisation. Rotational assignments ensured that clinics remained staffed. Training protocols standardized treatment. Japanese medical personnel, many of whom had remained during the war, were gradually reintegrated under American supervision. Their expertise was necessary, but authority remained clearly defined. Care was collaborative, but control was retained. For Japanese war orphans, this marked the true end of uncertainty. Shelters became permanent spaces rather than temporary refuges. Beds were assigned. Clothing was issued. Medical checkups followed schedules rather than emergencies. Children began to anticipate tomorrow rather than simply survive today. The war, for them, did not end with surrender documents, it ended with routine. This normalization carried psychological weight. Authority no longer arrived suddenly in moments of fear. It existed daily, predictably, without spectacle. There were no ceremonies marking this shift. No public declarations. The turning point was administrative, not symbolic. And yet its impact was profound. Enemy perception shifted quietly. Japanese civilians, long conditioned to expect punishment from occupying forces, observed a different reality. The same power that had destroyed cities was now regulating milk distribution, vaccination schedules, and school reopening. This contradiction complicated narratives built during years of wartime propaganda. It did not erase trauma, but it altered expectations. At the policy level, lessons learned in Japan reinforced patterns already emerging in Europe. Occupation governance increasingly defined success through civilian stabilization metrics. Child welfare became a transferable framework, applied across cultures, regions, and administrative systems. What mattered was not ideology, but method. Identification, routine, documentation, and continuity. The turning point crystallized when relief agencies entered an environment already shaped by military administration. Organizations such as UNRRA did not arrive to chaos. They inherited functioning systems, registries, feeding programs, and medical protocols established under occupation authority. This continuity ensured that responsibility could transition without collapse. By early 1946, the transformation was complete. Care for enemy children was no longer remarkable. It was expected. It was measured. It was enforced through procedure rather than emotion. The presence of American nurses treating Japanese war orphans without hesitation had ceased to be an exception, and had become the rule. This moment redefined victory. Power was no longer expressed solely through control of territory or disarmament of forces. It was exercised through sustained governance, through the capacity to impose order without vengeance. The shelters and clinics stood as evidence that authority could be maintained through care as effectively as through force. And as these systems stabilized daily life across occupied Japan, their consequences extended into the aftermath, shaping recovery, influencing policy, and altering how the war's end would be remembered by those who had lived through it as children. By the spring of 1946, the immediate emergency had passed, but its imprint remained visible across occupied Japan. The shelter and medical systems established during the first months after surrender were no longer operating in crisis mode. They had settled into maintenance. Records stabilized. Supply chains normalized. Clinics shifted from treating acute starvation to monitoring recovery. For American occupation authorities, this phase marked a change in tone. Early reports had emphasized urgency, shortages, exposure, and disease risk. Now they focused on outcomes. Weight charts showed gradual improvement. Infection rates declined in districts where shelters operated consistently. Mortality among orphan children dropped sharply compared to the final months of the war. These changes were not dramatic. They were incremental, but they were measurable. The presence of organized childcare altered the daily rhythm of occupied cities. Streets once filled with displaced civilians became more regulated. Children who had slept in ruins or crowded basements were no longer visible in public spaces. Their absence signaled progress. Not celebration, but stabilization. American military governments monitored these indicators closely. Weekly situation reports included shelter capacity, staffing levels, and food consumption. These documents reveal a broader shift in occupation priorities. Child welfare was no longer treated as a special case. It had become part of routine governance, alongside sanitation, housing, and education. The psychological effects extended beyond the children themselves. For Japanese civilians, especially those who had survived bombing campaigns and displacement, the shelters represented a departure from wartime expectations. Authority had not disappeared, but its expression had changed. Control was exercised through schedules rather than intimidation. Compliance was achieved through predictability rather than fear. This did not erase resentment or grief. Loss remained everywhere, but the presence of functioning systems reduced uncertainty. Parents searching for missing children knew where to ask. Communities could observe tangible signs of order returning. Schools reopened, often using buildings that had previously served as shelters. Education resumed without ideological instruction, focused instead on basic literacy, health, and structure. Institutionally, the groundwork laid during occupation began shaping long-term policy. Health data gathered from shelters informed broader public health planning under the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers. Nutritional deficiencies identified among orphans contributed to nationwide feeding initiatives, including early school lunch programs. Pediatric care protocols introduced during occupation influenced post-war medical standards. The transition of responsibility was deliberate. Relief organizations gradually assumed operational roles, inheriting facilities originally established by American military units. UNRRA reports from late 1946 acknowledged that many effective childcare systems were already in place upon their arrival. The handover was not abrupt. Military oversight receded in stages, ensuring continuity rather than disruption. For the children who passed through these shelters, outcomes varied. Some were reunited with surviving relatives located through registries and Red Cross coordination. Others entered foster arrangements or permanent institutions under Japanese administration. Trauma did not vanish. Many carried physical and psychological scars that would last a lifetime. But the presence of structure altered trajectories. Survival gave way to recovery. From a strategic perspective, occupation authorities noted secondary effects. Stabilized child populations reduced pressure on patrol units. Scavenging declined. Public health risks diminished. These outcomes reinforced the logic that child welfare was not only a moral concern, but a security asset. By mid-1946, the emergency phase of child administration had concluded. What remained was a system integrated into the broader framework of reconstruction. The shelters no longer represented improvisation. They were components of governance. Yet the deeper significance of this aftermath was still unfolding. The long-term consequences, social, moral, and historical, would emerge gradually, shaped by memory, policy, and the quiet judgments of those who had lived through occupation as children. As occupation entered its second year, the legacy of those early childcare efforts became clearer, not through public declarations, but through long-term shifts in Japanese society. The children who had passed through shelters began aging out of emergency care. They entered schools, apprenticeships, and, eventually, the workforce. Their experiences did not define post-war Japan on their own, but they quietly influenced how the next generation understood authority, responsibility, and humanity. Japanese administrators who assumed control of orphanages and clinics inherited systems shaped by Allied priorities. Record-keeping, hygiene standards, and nutritional benchmarks were now normalized. This administrative continuity mattered. It prevented a collapse when foreign oversight diminished. More importantly, it embedded child welfare into the rebuilding state as a permanent obligation rather than a temporary response to disaster. Educational reforms reflected this shift. Teachers working with former war orphans reported high levels of discipline mixed with emotional withdrawal. These observations entered early post-war psychological studies, prompting attention to trauma and loss, subjects rarely acknowledged before 1945. While resources remained limited, awareness itself marked a change. Children were no longer viewed solely as future labor or soldiers. They were recognized as individuals shaped by experience. For the United States, the outcomes reinforced a broader occupation narrative. Reports sent to Washington emphasized that humanitarian administration had contributed to stability. This framing mattered during the early Cold War. Japan was no longer just a defeated enemy, it was becoming a strategic partner. The success of civilian relief, especially for children, was cited as evidence that reconstruction could succeed without prolonged coercion. Yet memory complicated this narrative. For many Japanese families, occupation remained inseparable from loss. Bombing, famine, and displacement had preceded relief. Gratitude and resentment coexisted. Oral histories collected decades later show conflicting recollections. Some former orphans remembered kindness without fully understanding its political context. Others recalled confusion, silence, and the ache of absence more than care. American nurses and administrators rarely remained in Japan long enough to witness these outcomes. Their assignments ended. They moved on to Korea, Europe, or civilian life. But their presence had left institutional traces. Training manuals, procedural guidelines, and health standards persisted. In this sense, their impact was less personal than structural. By the early 1950s, with the occupation formally ended, Japan's child welfare system stood transformed compared to its pre-war form. The war had destroyed families, but it had also forced the creation of mechanisms to protect children without them. This transformation did not erase suffering. It reorganized response. Internationally, Japan's experience informed post-war humanitarian doctrine. The treatment of enemy children during occupation became a reference point in later conflicts. Military planners and relief agencies studied what had worked. Not because it was ideal, but because it had prevented collapse. Care for children was increasingly framed as a stabilizing force, not a sentimental one. For the children themselves, adulthood arrived quietly. Few public memorials marked their survival. Their stories were not celebrated in parades or carved into monuments. Instead, they lived on in fragments, medical files, school records, faded photographs, and private memories. Some became teachers, doctors, factory workers. Others struggled, bearing invisible wounds. History rarely records gratitude or confusion with precision. But the aftermath of those months in occupied Japan revealed something enduring. Systems built for mercy can outlast the conditions that created them. And it is here, beyond victory and defeat, beyond uniform and nationality, that the deeper meaning of this episode begins to surface, waiting to be examined not as policy, but as legacy. In the final accounting of the Second World War, victory is usually measured in surrendered armies, signed documents, and redrawn borders. Yet some of the war's most consequential moments occurred far from conference tables and battle maps. Inside improvised clinics, overcrowded shelters, and dim hospital wards where children waited without parents and without certainty. For Japanese war orphans, the arrival of American nurses did not feel like liberation. It felt like interruption. Their world had collapsed quietly, piece by piece, long before uniforms changed. What they encountered in those months after surrender was not triumph, but routine, thermometers, ration cards, clean bandages, recorded names. Care was delivered without ceremony, and without distinction between enemy and ally. That absence of judgment mattered more than any speech. For the nurses themselves, the experience challenged assumptions carried across the Pacific. They had trained to heal American soldiers. Instead, they treated children who spoke a different language, bore the marks of a war the United States had helped devastate, and carried grief too deep to articulate. The work offered no medals. It offered no clear ending. It demanded patience, restraint, and moral clarity in spaces where politics receded and necessity ruled. This episode does not erase the destruction that preceded it. It does not absolve the bombing, the hunger, or the displacement. But it complicates the narrative of occupation. It reveals a moment when power translated into responsibility, and when mercy became administrative, deliberate, and sustained. In the decades that followed, Japan rebuilt itself into a nation defined not by the ruins of 1945, but by the structures that replaced them. Among those structures was a recognition earned through catastrophe that children are not collateral. They are continuity. The war orphans rarely appear in official histories. They left no manifestos, commanded no divisions, signed no treaties. Yet their survival reshaped post-war society in quiet ways, carried forward through institutions, values, and memory. History often asks who won and who lost. This story asks something different: what remained and how it was treated. In the care of enemy children without question, the war's final lesson emerged not in strategy or ideology, but in humanity, measured not by words, but by hands that chose to heal when they could have turned away. That choice, made in silence, endured long after the guns fell silent.